Welcome to the On the Blue Line podcast. I am your host and the founder of On the Blue Line, Wayne Mulder. On the Blue Line is striving to be a resource for law enforcement and law enforcement supporters for their everyday life. This is our interview show. We simply call this the interview room. In this show, we will be interviewing leaders from law enforcement, business, life, those who can provide insight, instruction, warnings, and even encouragement for living our day-to-day lives. What many of us have in common is working in and around law enforcement. But what we want to be is a resource for all the other areas of our life. You know, we were never meant to do life alone. That brotherhood, that camaraderie, that is inherent to this job. And it's also the way we should approach everyday life. We are in this together. And this is what On the Blue Line is all about. A gathering of people from all walks of life, united by law enforcement, but focused on being successful in all facets of our daily lives. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. We have some great guests lined up in the coming weeks, and I truly believe that this will continue to be a great resource of information for you in the years ahead. So I want to welcome you, and without further delay, the interview room begins now.
On my honor, I will never betray my badge, my integrity, my character, or the public trust. I will always have the courage to hold myself and others accountable for their actions. I will always uphold the Constitution, the community, and the agency I serve.
This week, I'm excited to be joined by Rich Milliman, the CEO of Extra Duty Solutions. For all my non-law enforcement listeners, extra duty are jobs that law enforcement officers engage in off-duty, or basically outside of whatever their normal hours are, and typically not through the agency directly. For instance, if a concert is going on in the area and they need law enforcement there for security, then they would hire officers extra duty at a predetermined rate to fill this role. This can be a great opportunity for officers to make a little extra money, especially since depending on budgets and their position, overtime may not be readily available. However, like so many things in law enforcement, these extra duty jobs are handled vastly different by agencies and officers across the country. And there are things that both officers and agencies should take into consideration with these programs. Rich joins me today to sit down and discuss the positive and negative sides of extra duty details and to provide some cautionary tales as well as success stories. Rich, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Wayne. It's nice to be here.
Rich, could you just take a moment and tell us a little bit about your experience and what brought you to Extra Duty Solutions?
Yeah, sure. My background is really in the world of risk. Before founding Extra Duty Solutions with my partner in 2015, I was the head of operational risk at a very large hedge fund. He was the head of physical security. Prior to that, I ran a bunch of mid-sized firms in business-to-business operations, risk, logistics. But at the hedge fund that we were at, we used to occasionally utilize extra duty officers for this or that reason, usually for security purposes. And in so doing, realized there were certain inefficiencies in that market, both from the agency side and the customer, the users of extra duty officers. And we decided to form a company to help make that a smoother world between the officers and the customer.
I would think there's a lot of key considerations that officers should take into thinking about and to take into consideration when they're looking at doing extra duty details.
Yeah, no, there definitely are. I think the first and the foremost consideration is why are you working extra duty to begin with, right? I mean, it's kind of like anything else in life. If you're doing this, you're not doing something else. So if you're spending 10 or 15 or so hours a week working extra duty details, those are 10 or 15 hours a week that you're not doing something else, which could be spending time with kids or relaxation or whatever. So, the first question that you should ask yourself is, why am I doing this? And the primary reason why most officers are working extra duty details is monetary. It can really help, especially if you're at the early stages of your career and the compensation is not that high. It can really help with getting money for extra things, basically, that you may be able not to afford if you don't do these. And the same at the other end of the career too. There's other benefits though to working extra duty. There's community policing benefit. There's a benefit of having more officers out there. So there's benefits for society, public safety generally. There's benefits for the agency, the police department or security or the sheriff's department. And there's benefit for the officer as well.
Generating income can be very important. And I know when I first came into law enforcement, I myself would pick up a lot of extra duties at that time. But I'm sure that it becomes a balance issue as well between those additional work hours and spending time with their friends, family, and loved ones.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And again, you should always ask yourself, why am I doing this? It's, where I've seen extra duty used well is where an officer says, the reason I'm trying to get this extra money is for X, Y, and Z. So, for example, I know one officer, he's now an assistant chief, and he said the first extra duty detail he ever worked is when his first daughter was born, his first child, and they needed extra money for daycare, which, it can be quite expensive. And the last detail he ever worked is when his third and final child graduated from daycare. So basically, he worked details to afford daycare, and that was it. And it was this much and no more. And that's what I would call a responsible way of utilizing or interacting with the extra duty world. If you're working to get some extra money for a summer vacation, for Christmas presents, and so on, that all makes sense to me. Where it can get a little dangerous is where you're working details for no apparent reason, but just to get as much money as possible, and you're not sure why you're doing that. Or, occasionally we get requests from bank officers are applying for mortgages or auto loans, boat loans, and they're coming to us to verify income, the extra duty income. And that's a red flag. We've actually called officers at times and said, hey, what are you doing? Because it's not guaranteed. Extra duty, the world of extra duty is voluntary world, and details themselves can come and go. Up north, where there's a lot of construction details, road jobs or traffic details, when the bridge is done and that's complete, 90% of the jobs can drop off right then and there. Or, if there's a large pharmaceutical plant, we've seen this happen, a large pharmaceutical plant in a geography, and they decide to cut back. They have cutbacks on expenses. And all of a sudden, 400 hours a week of extra duty goes away. So you don't want to utilize the extra duty for mortgages and things that, are day-to-day needs that you have. It's a good use of extra duty is better used for nice to haves. And if you don't have the money, it's not like you can't afford your mortgage anymore. If you don't have the money, maybe you take a 1 week instead of a 2 week summer vacation, but you're still okay. So that's the ebb and the flow, or the yin and the yang of extra duty. It's a great tool to increase income, but do it in a responsible way.
Based on kind of what you're saying there, of course, your experience being on the financial security side of the house, would you say that there needs to be more of a financial planning or a proper financial management side to someone considering do a lot of extra duties?
Yeah, it's more just sort of thinking through it. I see a lot of officers, and we're in many states coast to coast, and I see this all over the place where, you can group officers into three buckets really when it comes to extra duty. There's the ones that will never ever work it no matter what. There's the ones that work at what I would call responsibly. They'll work one or two details a week or a reasonable amount, and they're trying to get money for a very specific goal. And then there's the ones that are working as many jobs as they can possibly get. And those are the ones I really question. You really probably should be in group 2, not group 3. In other words, you should really think through, why are you spending all your time this way? And what are you going to do with all this money? Is it really worth an extra hour of your life sitting in the cruiser at a road job where you could be doing something else with that time? Do you really need the money that much? And what are you going to use that money for? What is it going to really buy you utility-wise that you're giving up by working that extra detail? So I don't think you have to go through sort of a financial plan or something like that, but you just need to think, why am I doing this? And what's the trade-off?
Do you think that is something that agencies can play a role in when it comes to cutting back on the number of hours that these people are working, or an officer, a deputy is working in extra duties, as far as putting a cap on that?
There are a lot of agencies that do put caps on the amount of extra duty that particular officers can work. So, for example, they might have a rule of no more than X hours in a 24-hour period, or no more than Y hours in a 7-day period, or something like that. Typically, that's not the genesis of those rules is not so much to help the officers make wise life choices, but it's more to decrease the probability of issues occurring from fatigue. And this is very real. We've seen it in our business. Just a few weeks ago, we got a photograph sent to us from a construction firm of an officer sleeping in a cruiser. And, we found out he just worked a 10-hour shift. and then went right to a 6-hour detail. And that 6 hour was a road job. You never know how long they're going to last. And that detail ended up going 12 hours, and he was exhausted. We've seen situations where officers worked an all night extra duty detail, got into a cruiser in the morning for their active duty shift, went around back and fell asleep in the cruiser. So a lot of times agencies will put in these rules to avoid problems like that and to avoid the fatigue issue. It's also good to have rules so that it forces officers to think, why am I doing this? If I'm trying to work more than the allotted hours or the hours that my agency thinks is a reasonable amount of hours to work, am I really making the right trade-offs? And should I rethink how I'm spending my time?
And I've seen that too on both sides. I know in my experience, you talk about sleeping in cars and so forth. And as a supervisor at an agency, I've seen that happen. And unfortunately, there's a whole disciplinary process and so forth that goes with that. And I would think from a risk perspective that there can be liability to both the agency who would allow an officer to work more than a number of hours, as well as to that officer themselves.
There is absolutely liability with that, and there's been in the last year there's been cases on the national news front that brought to the forefront the notion of how many hours officers are working active plus extra duty combined. So having some type of a risk reduction, both for the agency and the officer, and also for society in general, to make sure that officers aren't being overextended and therefore working whether active duty or extra duty or both when they're not alert, makes perfect sense. I mean, look at airlines, right? They have very strict laws around captains and how much they can fly and how much they can be in uniform. I mean, there's been studies that showed that in the world of policing, just putting on that uniform raises your blood pressure slightly. So if that uniform's on 85 hours a week, whether you're actively physically active or whether you're sitting behind a desk, you have 85 hours a week of high blood pressure, or higher than you would normally have. So there's a consideration for that. So I do think that it makes sense for an agency and the officer to sort of think through how to reduce the risk of too much.
Yeah, and I think that's part of why I wanted to have this conversation, because it's such a big part of what impacts their personal lives. There's been several studies, like you said, recently with even working more than 8 to 10 hour shifts. And I know a lot of law enforcement agencies have gone to the 12-hour shifts because the guys like them better. It gives them more days off. Theoretically, more days off. You're working the same number of hours, but you're getting more days of the week off. However, if you're doing 12-hour shifts coupled with extra duty assignments, coupled with a family, so forth, when are you sleeping? When are you having that downtime to decompress?
Yeah, exactly. And look, I don't want to go down too far of a negative path. There's some huge benefits to extra duty. We talked about the monetary benefit from the officer's perspective, and clearly that can become seductive, right? More money is better than less money. As Bruce Springsteen says, poor men want to be rich and rich men want to be kings, right? And that's just the nature of humans. So you do need to self-control a little bit. You need to sort of self-control that yin and the yang, and sort of where am I spending my time versus how much money do I want. But there's major benefits for the agencies, for officers, for society of extra duty. I'll give you one where we knew of a case. This happened about 2 months ago in one of our footprints in one of our agencies, where there was a need for police presence in an active duty situation. It was a robbery at a retail store. Right across the street from that retail store was a quick service restaurant where there was an officer working an extra duty detail. He got called away from that detail. He was there in probably 90 seconds. If they had to call patrol, it would have been several minutes and the robbery would have been done. Who knows what would have happened? So it does get more police out there. It gets more of a presence of police. When you walk into a movie theater and you see an officer standing there, there's more of a police presence and there's more of an opportunity to interact with police on a human level, and not what you see on TV and so on. So there's huge benefit. It needs to be a balance. It needs to be a balance both from the standpoint of how are we individually spending our time? How are officers individually spending their time? And does it make sense to work that 81st hour of the week versus spending time with the children? And it also makes sense from the agency standpoint to put some guardrails around it to make sure that we're not overextending the officers with fatigue issues, and therefore there's bad decision making or other bad outcomes.
Well said. And I think that is such an important part of not only what we're trying to do and what you guys are trying to do is that whole idea of balance, because you can go too far one way or the other, but these programs, like you said, offer so many great things to the officers, the community, and even like you had mentioned, that community-oriented policing side of the equation, and even more ILP or intelligence-led policing agencies. It allows those officers to be in the community, gaining information, talking to people. I know down here I'm in the Florida market, and down in this area, it's not uncommon to have off duties in neighborhoods because there's so many communities and they'll hire in an extra duty capacity. And that allows the officers to go through these neighborhoods, make contact with citizens during that 4 or 6 hour period, and allows them to concentrate on that particular area, something they wouldn't be able to do if they were responding to normal patrol calls for service.
Yeah, exactly. And look, we receive a lot of feedback on officers working in an extra duty capacity. Some of the feedback is not positive. Some of it is we don't want that officer to show up here again or whatever. And a lot of it's unreasonable. The officer did not interact with the people here. Well, that's not his job. It's the officer. Your reason you're hiring an officer is for some form of security. Or risk mitigation purpose, not to be a ringmaster, right? So, and we tell customers, look, that's not really the role here, right? But we do also get a lot of positive feedback. I mean, a surprising amount of positive feedback. I'll give you an example. There was a large retailer who's down south requested 2 officers for a festival they were having. So it was kind of a summer festival where they were going to have clowns and balloons and food and pony rides and all that kind of stuff. And after the festival was over, we had never worked with this customer before, so the account manager called the customer and said, "We're just checking in. Did everything go okay? Had officers show up on time?" And they couldn't stop raving about how great these 2 officers were. And they said, look, they went well beyond providing security. They helped the clown fix the balloon machine. They interacted with the children. They actually became part of the festival. And so the account manager said, would you mind sending me an email with what you just said? And they did, and we sent it to our liaison in that department, and it made it into the HR files of both of those officers. So there's a great example of, talk about community policing. There's an opportunity for the officers to interact in a different way than they're typically or sometimes interacting with the community. And it's all because they're, quote unquote, working in this extra duty capacity, but it gives them an opportunity to interact in a certain way, which is greatly positive for all parties involved.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me just quickly interrupt this podcast. I just wanted to take a moment and tell you, if you have not checked out our On the Blue Line Guild, our closed Facebook group, On the Blue Line Guild, that's GUILD, the link is in our show notes. We'd love to have you join. The goal in there is to continue these conversations. So exactly what we're going over on these podcasts with our guests in our Monday morning roll call, we get back to in there and we go over a little bit deeper. We just get a little bit more into the subjects, and we try to keep pretty constant conversations going and some uplifting encouragement and some information like that may help you in your day-to-day lives. So please check it out after the show. It's in the show notes on the Blue Line Guild. Now back to the show. You had mentioned earlier, and some of the listeners of the show, most of them are law enforcement, but some are not. And so you had mentioned earlier the off-duty job where the gentleman had left and was pulled off due to a robbery to respond. And most people, especially those in law enforcement, understand that this is a 24/7 job. So you do have a duty to act no matter what you're doing, whether it's extra duty or you're out with the family at McDonald's. But regardless of the situation, when that happens and they are pulled off that extra duty, are they now back on the clock with the agency? Are they still on that extra duty as far as from an employment standpoint?
Typically, the way that works is if an officer is working an extra duty detail and it's supposed to be an 8-hour detail, and at hour 3, he gets called by dispatch, leave that post and go to the corner of 4th and Main. We need backup. That's when that extra duty detail ends, right then and there. And the customer will only be charged for those 3 hours, not the 8 hours. So he's back on the clock, if you will. It may be overtime, but he's back on the active duty clock at that moment in time. It's even more stringent than that. That's a blatant example, right? But here, let me give you another example. Let's say an officer is working security at a bank branch in an extra duty detail, and he hears somebody just outside the branch yell help. The second he starts moving towards that person, he's now actually considered active duty. So even in a situation like that, where it wasn't blatant dispatch called, leave your post, come over here, he would be considered active duty at that point, both from a standpoint of when is the customer stop paying and who's paying him, and also from the standpoint of insurance and liability situation.
One question I kind of want to go back to, you had mentioned it, and I want to caution the listeners and so forth that yes, we had talked about balance. There's pros, there's cons, there's positive, there's negative. So I don't want to go too far down the negative road. But when you and I had first spoke, when it comes to cautionary tales for law enforcement officers, when they are sitting there thinking about what they're going to engage in, I know you said that there are some behaviors where you've had situations where people were sleeping and so forth, but I believe you had also said there were some more serious situations that you've dealt with where officers have actually gotten themselves in trouble, up to even criminal situations.
Yeah, we have one department that we administer the program for where we were actually called in by the county attorney. It was requested that we come in and administer the program because there was blatant unethical behavior going on. And I can't remember the number. I believe it was 3 or 4 or 5 officers ended up indicted in this particular department. And what was going on there was, there were no-show jobs. There were under-the-table cash payments. There were dirty things, I would say. I'll give you one example that I know of. Another department that we're talking to, they had a situation where there was a large construction site. And so trucks going to that construction site would pull up, and an officer would approach the truck and say, where are you going? Well, it was an asphalt truck. So very clearly the asphalt truck is going to the construction site. And an asphalt truck, you have a certain amount of time to get the asphalt in the ground or your truck turns into concrete. And the driver would say, yeah, I'm going to the site. Here's my papers and so on. And the officer in this particular case would say, well, by local ordinance, you need to have a police escort. Now, I can either just hop in the cab and you could pay me $60 right here and now to drive with you the 2 blocks to the construction site, or I can call back to the department and maybe they'll send somebody. It could take a couple hours. So which would you rather do? And, of course, he'd say, well, I didn't know this, but I have $60 on me and let's do that. And the officer would say, okay, just give me the $60 and go ahead. And this is a real story. And we're aware of a number of officers who got indicted over stuff like this. So it can be seductive, right? It can open the door. We're aware of a number of departments, and there's such a thing in the extra duty world as a coordinator. A coordinator is somebody within the department, a sworn officer, who manages a particular customer. So I may be the coordinator for the mall, right, the local mall. 99% of the time, it's effective. It works fine. I am managing the mall. When there's an issue, the mall comes to me. I am their account rep, if you will. I'm their point guard. They like it. I like it. I get paid for the time I'm putting the schedules together and so on. But 1% of the time, it's really bad. And, you want to work at the mall? The mall's my client. $60 an hour is the pay. I'll take 10, you get 50. Or white envelopes at the end of the night, requests for tickets to the local professional basketball team. And it can be seductive, right? So, and I'm not saying, therefore, there should be no coordinators. Like I said, 99%, it's a very effective way to kind of help the department manage the customer base. But there should be some guardrails around it. There should be some checks and balances, just like anything else in life, to ensure that somebody's not being led astray 1 inch at a time.
That's so important, like in general, when it comes to life, because we're in a human business. Law enforcement officers are human, and people make mistakes. They make poor decisions. And that's where you said the checks and balances, they're so very, very important.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's like, and I forget where I heard this, but you get to jail 1 inch at a time. You usually don't wake up and decide to commit manslaughter, right? So, we had a case just last month, and I could rattle off a bunch of them, but I'll just give you one example. It was a relatively new officer, new to the department and new to law enforcement, and he had signed up for 4 details, extra duty details in the same month, and all 4 of these details, about a half an hour before the detail started, he canceled himself out of it and gave it to another person. And, we've seen it all. I mean, we've been around the block. In the last year, we've paid about $30 million to officers for extra duty details. So we've seen a lot of situations, and we knew what was going on here. This guy was basically brokering details, right? So he would sign up for details, he'd get it. no intention of working it, call somebody and say, hey, I'm supposed to work, at the game tonight. It's $50 an hour. You want to do it? I'll give you 35. I'll take 15. And, in a situation like that, it's our responsibility. We work for the municipality. We work for the chief, the agency. It's our responsibility to inform that this is happening. Here's what we think is happening. Take it from here. You guys are the detectives, not us. But, 9 times out of 10, we're right as to what's going on. So if I summarize kind of the extra duty world, it's a great thing for all the parties involved, but it can be seductive. So, and like you said, we're all humans. We want more money rather than less money. And it's a lot of times the extra duty program within a department is not there's not checks and balances around it. There's not guardrails. In some cases, it's the absolute Wild West. I mean, there are some departments and some states where officers or working details are being hired directly by the customers or by security firms who are putting them into customer situations, and the department has no idea who's working where. Meanwhile, these officers are in full uniform, displaying their badge, carrying their firearm. The department has no idea that they're, working a detail at a Waffle House that night. So some checks and balances, some guardrails are really called for in this world, so you can get the benefit without incurring the bad stuff.
And that's exactly where I wanted to go next. So there are, and correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of vastly different ways across the United States that these are set up, or in some cases not set up at all when it comes to extra duty programs. I know years ago, and it was before my time in law enforcement, but I've heard stories of it used to just kind of be, they would call up, I need an officer, the officer would show up. At the end of the day, they'd hand them cash, and that'd be it. Are you still seeing that kind of older way of doing business out there?
Yeah, it's becoming less and less frequent, and a lot of it depends on the rules in the states and the local ordinances and so on. You have some states where it's pretty buttoned up, and there are ordinances, either local or statewide, regarding how this has to work. There are some states, for example, where customers cannot directly pay police officers. You have to pay the municipality. They then pay the officers. So there's a flow of money. It's visible. There's transparency to it. Well, but there are still some states where if you're a law enforcement agency, you can work anywhere in that state. Right. So if I am a police officer in town A, I can go over to town B where I am not a sworn officer, but I am sworn in that state and work a detail in that town. And I can get paid in cash at the end of the night directly from the customer. And this opens up a whole, plethora of badness, if you will. Right. So, one issue, I'll give you another real example. This happened about 3 or 4 months ago. It was out west at a state that allows this type of thing. And he said he had a situation where there was police activity, a need for police, again, due to a robbery at a building, and he had patrol go over there, and it took a number of minutes for patrol to arrive. Unbeknownst to him, there was a sworn officer working a detail right across the street, but he didn't know about it because that sworn officer was put there by a security firm who could make a higher margin by taking a sworn officer from the next town who had lower rates and putting them into that situation. So there's a situation where the benefit of the extra duty program was not realized because of, I would say it was greed, but it was, a not well thought out approach. So these types of things kind of really need to be buttoned up, and more they are. The other area where, you're saying sort of the hangover from the old days is this cash at the end of the night. Everybody today walks around with a movie camera on their phone. So do you really want, on YouTube tomorrow or Sunday morning, a video of one of your officers in uniform getting cash outside a bar or a white envelope? I mean, nothing good, will come from this, right? So again, and it's not rocket science. It's a little bit of checks and balances. It's a little bit of putting guardrails around it, just thinking through it so that you don't get yourself into these situations.
A lot of what you had just mentioned obviously talks about the risk for the agency, but there's also a risk for the officer when they're being paid directly by the customer, is there not?
Again, here's a recent case. There were 2 officers requested by a concert promoter to work a particular concert. And at the end of the night, they were supposed to get, X dollars a night. And the promoter said, well, not as many people showed up as we thought. So instead of X, it's Y. and Y was half of X. So what are the officers supposed to do now, right? Are they supposed to just say, okay, sorry, we'll take Y, which is clearly not good for the officers because thought they were going to make a certain amount of money? Or are they supposed to say, where's my money? In uniform, it creates a lot of risk for everybody involved. And, related to this too is, you're law enforcement. You're not a collection agent, right? So what happens if the landscaper or whomever doesn't pay? What do you do? There's one department that we recently started administering their program, and they said, look, one of the reasons that we really want you guys to administer the program is to get us out of this situation where officers are having to go back to the detail location and say, do you have my money? A, it's a horrible use of time. But B, just think about how the optics of that, it looks horrible. So yeah, so there's risk associated with it. And a lot of this risk, all this risk that we're talking about, the bad outcomes are easily avoidable with just some checks and balances and guardrails.
When it comes to an agency, so now an agency or department decides, you know what, we're going to take on the extra duty program within house, or they're going to hire a company such as yours, what do they need to keep in mind when it comes to officers' pay?
Yeah, so when it comes to officer pay, I would say there's a couple of things to keep in mind. One is, what's the general level? And the level of officer pay for extra duty, we have seen it range from $25 an hour to over $200 an hour. Now, the over $200 an hour is it has to be, the planets have to be aligned. So it was a big city. It has to be a Saturday, a national holiday, a job that involves liquor, and a supervising officer. But if you multiply it out, it comes out to over $200 an hour. We've seen more normally, we see rates up north. I've seen officer rates of 70, 80 an hour in big cities, around big cities. Down south, it can go into the 30s or low 40s, and out west, usually the 40s, and the Midwest, 50s or so. So think about what are the other departments around us charging. We should be consummate with that. And a lot of times, when a department is considering utilizing our service, they'll say, what are other departments charging around us? And we'll do a study for them and show. So you want to be kind of consummate with that. You also want to be consummate with what are the other opportunities for officers. So some departments have secondary employment, right? So we're not so much extra duty details, but where you can actually get a second job working at Lowe's at night or something like that. So you want to be benchmark yourself relative to a job like that, right? I mean, are you incenting officers to work extra duty, or are you incenting them to go somewhere else and work something else? Also look at what is your city overtime rate. We've seen certain departments where it's virtually impossible to get an officer to work an extra duty detail because the amount and the pay on city overtime rates, city overtime details. And the other thing you want to consider too when it comes to pay is not just the level of pay, but when are officers getting paid? So this is another kind of darkness of the extra duty world that I've seen. There are some departments, even if it's not permissible in the state, I've seen it happen, where the municipality says, well, the officer gets paid when we get paid. In other words, if I'm working at bank extra duty detail and the bank doesn't pay their invoice from the municipality for 3 months, I don't get paid for 3 months. And to me, this is colossally unethical. It would be like I had a company that manufactures tires and you work for me on the line. And at the end of 2 weeks, you come and say, where's my paycheck? And I say, oh, wait, I didn't sell all those tires yet. And I didn't get paid for the tires. So once I get paid from, General Motors, I'll give you your pay. That's just not the way labor laws work in America or anywhere in the world, really. And it's clearly not ethical. So along with the level of pay, the other thing the municipality needs to keep in mind is when are you paying the officers and what does that float cost, right? So if I'm a town and I have a bank in my town and they want extra duty officers and they typically don't pay me for 2 or 3 months because they have a bureaucracy and they has to go to finance and they have to pay the invoices in a certain way, I'm floating that money for 2 or 3 months. I'm essentially giving that bank an interest-free loan for 2 or 3 months. So that needs to be taken into consideration. A lot of cities will have city admin fees. So if the officer is making $45 an hour, the city might throw another $2 on top or $3 on top and charge 47 or 48. And that 2 or 3 goes to finance the float. It goes for wear and tear on uniforms. It goes for other aspects of the cost of of running an extra duty program. Somebody has to send out invoices, somebody has to make collection calls, and so on. That's perfectly legitimate. But not paying the officer until the bank pays the municipality or the customer pays the municipality, to me is part of the pay world, pay aspect of extra duty that really needs to be shored up.
Outside of pay, are there any other concerns or considerations that agencies or municipalities should take into their consideration and what they're going to do as far as an extra duty program?
Well, I'm always surprised when I sit down with CFOs or business administrators for municipalities, even larger municipalities, that they don't really have a good understanding of the costs associated with administering an extra duty program. And we touched on a couple of these, but some of the costs that you have are your float costs, right? So the officer works today, you're paying him tomorrow, you don't get your money for 3 weeks or 2 months or whatever it is. You're floating all that money. You have bad debts expense. You're going to have sooner or later some landscaper that by city ordinance has to have an officer because he's closing down a lane of traffic, pay the officer, he goes out of business the next day. That's going to happen, right? So you have bad debts expense. Like I said, you have somebody that is sending out invoices and collections. That's usually somebody on the finance side of the municipality. Some municipalities have 2 or 3 people that are doing that. You usually have somebody on the law enforcement side, and often it's a sworn officer who's taking the calls from the customers, sometimes 24/7. Some of the bigger agencies that we administer the programs for will get 10 or 15 calls between midnight and 8 a.m. for a service for extra duty because a water main broke, or there's live wires on the street and the local utility has to get this cleaned up, and by city ordinance they have to have 2 officers. There's a lot of costs associated with administering a program, and the municipality should be aware of those costs. We had one municipality that we started working with about 1.5 years ago, and before we started, the BA said, I want to have an accounting firm do an audit of our program to find out what does it really cost to run the program. And I think the reason he wanted to do that is to make sure that we weren't charging in our admin fee something ridiculous and having huge profits rolling in. And what they found is that it cost them $330,000 a year to run their program. And what he thought that number was going to come out to be was more like $80,000 or $90,000 a year. So that's a real consideration is the cost. Another consideration is who's doing what, right? So you have, in a lot of departments, I see this over and over again, you'll have a sergeant or a lieutenant that's quote unquote running the program. And what that means is they're taking calls from vendors, from construction companies, from retailers, and so on, asking what are your rates, what's the minimum number of hours I need to hire an officer for, will you work a liquor job, I need 2 officers for Saturday night, or it's 5 a.m. and it's raining, so I can't do my job today. I need to switch my office tomorrow. Is this really why you went into law enforcement, to become a dispatch on the outside world for the extra duty? And is that really the best use of time for a sergeant or a lieutenant, somebody who's made it up the ranks in law enforcement and has a certain skill set, that they're just answering the calls and sort of explaining how the program works? So that's another consideration. Who's doing what? And is it really efficient to run the program in this way? Or is it more efficient to run it in some other way and get those 2 sergeants or whomever is taking those calls to more of a law enforcement role? So I would say those are the biggest consideration is, what is it really costing you to do this? Number one. And number 2 is, who's doing what?
Quick question, or kind of going down that same road. Are officers protected if they're injured while working an extra duty job?
So as you probably know, there's 2 types of insurance. There's liability insurance and workers' comp insurance. So the easy one is the liability insurance. And typically the municipality has liability insurance that covers officers in a variety of ways and a variety of locations. And a lot of times municipalities will require customers, those hiring the extra duty officers, to show a COI, a certificate of insurance, proving that they have liability insurance. So if there is some type of a mishap, an officer has anything in the liability world, that there is coverage from the customer side of things, right? That one's a little bit easier. The trickier one is workers' comp, right? And workers' comp varies state by state, and it varies municipality by municipality oftentimes. So in certain states, the ones that, in my opinion, are kind of run the right way, if you're in law enforcement, you're covered under the workers' comp no matter what you're doing. So if you happen to go out to see a movie and you're in uniform and something happens and you blaze into action and twist your ankle, you're covered under the workers' comp. If you're working an extra duty detail, you're covered under the municipal's workers' comp. So that's the most black and white version of it. But there are some municipalities where it's fuzzy. In certain cases, what municipalities will try to do is get the customer to cover the officer while the officer is on location at that customer's location working an extra duty detail. This is a bit in the gray area. So the way workers' comp works is it's by payroll, right? So if I'm an insurance company offering you workers' comp, I'm going to price it based on your payroll. Now, if you have a bunch of extra duty officers working that I don't know about and you're not paying, you're giving them cash, and maybe that's reported, maybe that's not reported, I, as an insurance company, am going to have an issue with that. And if that gets disclosed at the time of an injury, I'm going to have an issue with that. And there's going to be, like the old expression, money never changes hand without a fight. So there's going to be a fight, at that point. But still, I see this, and I always, when we go into new agencies who are talking to us about the potential of us administering the program, I always bring this up. Like, how are these guys covered under workers' comp? There's also certain state laws that can come into conflict with this. So, for example, a municipality may require customers to show a COI evidencing workers' comp and sign a form that says officers are covered under workers' comp or workers' comp when they're here. But there may be a state law that's in conflict with that. A state law that for example, I know one state where if you're a legal entity, when you have less than 5 employees, you don't have to have workers' comp insurance. So there's nothing to stop me from signing some document that says, yeah, you guys are covered while you're here, and I don't even have workers' comp insurance.
Rich, we're starting to wind down on time here. I had kind of mentioned this question to you in advance, but let me ask you, in your experience and based on your background, what do you think is one of the most important things officers can do to help themselves in their personal lives?
Well, and I think my answer is going to be broader than just for officers themselves, but and it's the same type of advice I've given to my kids. Look, life is kind of a series of decisions where you're weighing the short term against the long term. That's kind of a summary of life, in my opinion, right? So I wake up tomorrow morning, I should really do a 4-mile run. It's raining, I'm sore, I had too much to eat the night before. I really don't feel like it. I am now in a short term versus long term decision. In the short term, the optimal thing is to lie in bed for another hour and a half. And in the long term, the optimal decision is to get out there and do the run, right? And it's the same is true. And again, my answer is geared in the extra duty world. And I'll go back to the beginning of our conversation, is working that next detail is a short-term versus long-term decision, right? In the short term, I'm going to get another $400 or $500 for working it. But in the long term, I just spent less time resting, or less time with my wife, or less time with children, or whatever, right? So, and this, while I'm giving the example of in the world of extra duty, it's true in life in general. Everything is short-term versus long-term. So just think about that as you make decisions. Am I making too many short-term focused decisions, in which case you're going to end up 5 years from now being overweight and all sorts of problems that most of us have? Or are you making too many long-term decisions and you're not enjoying life at all? You're delaying the benefits of life, in a sense. So as a law enforcement officer, where there are these opportunities to work things like city overtime and extra duty and so on, it's a short-term versus long-term, and always consider that.
Very good. Well, Rich, I really appreciate you coming on. Let me just ask, how can people connect with you and learn more about your work at Extra Duty Solutions?
Yeah, so our website is extradutysolutions, all one word.com, and on there you can download our general presentation. It tells you a lot about what we do. There's a 3-minute video that explains what we do on there. And if you'd like to talk to us about your program, we'd love to hear from you. The best way to get in touch with us is to email us at info@extradutysolutions.com, info@extradutysolutions.com.
Well, thank you again, Rich, and we'll make sure that we put those links into our show notes so that any of the listeners, both the officers as well as agency directors and so forth that listen to this show, will be able to get to that information. Thank you again for your time.
Thanks for having me on. It was a pleasure.
So with that, this week's interview room is over. If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to head on over to iTunes and leave us a rating and review. This is very important for us to continue to get this message out there. Also, if you have any questions or comments, please send those in, email them, go through the website. But we love to hear that feedback from you. We do this for you, the listeners, so please get with us, reach out to us, and we will certainly answer any questions. And if we can, we'll even deal with it in some future episodes. Our contact information and all social media links are on our website, which is ontheblueline.com. I thank you for listening. Have a great week. Don't miss our weekly podcast, releases every Monday morning, simply called Monday Morning Roll Call. And the next interview room will be released in 2 weeks on Thursday. I'll see you then. And in the meantime, I'll see you out there on the Blue Line.